Hi everyone, in this video we're going to go over inhibitory and excitatory neurons. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of context, right? So the first thing is, what are these neurons? So in the previous video, we had a brief introduction about how action potentials pass through neurons and so on and so forth, and how neurons play a role in how we think, right? So in this, there are some neurons that push you push the neurons to fire or tell your neurons to not fire. And let's talk about why this is important, right? When we're processing information or when we're thinking about information, what often happens is that we're processing information, right? So let's say we're making a decision of whether to drink water or whether to not drink water. This is a very over exaggerated example, but it's a good example for understanding. So my brain, my hypothalamus is telling me that I'm thirsty, which is pushing some neurons in the hypothalamus to let my brain get the water. But another part of me says, or the neurons that sense warmth and the neurons that are, or the nerves that sense warmth and tell me, you're so comfy, you can wait until the morning to drink some water. So those are suppressing my urge to get water, right? So the neurons in my thalamus and on other regions of the brain are actively receiving suppressing signals and excitatory neuron signals. But at one point, my hypothalamus tells me very, very strongly. So a large portion of neurons continuously fire because neurons don't fire faster. They fire at the same rate, but more neurons fire, which overcomes my which raises the potential of the neurons and to minus 55 millivolts, which tells me, okay, fine, you should go get the water, right? So that's a very over exaggerated, very oversimplified example of what goes on in the brain, right? So in this, let's now specify it down to inhibitory and excitatory neurons. So inhibitory neurons are neurons that suppress firing. So let's highlight that. These are neurons that suppress firing. So this is a way to think about it and how I originally started to understand, right? So when you have excitatory neurons, what essentially happens is there are specific neurotransmitters that are either excitatory or inhibitory. Since excitatory neurons push you to fire, I'll just abbreviate that as EXC, pushes you to fire. I usually think of them as a positive charge, right? So they push you to fire. But inhibitory neurons, on the other side, inhibitory, I'll just enumerate it as INH, push you to not fire. So I thought of it as a negative charge. And specific neurotransmitters are only excitatory or only inhibitory. I'll get more into that later in the video. So what happens is your cell body or your soma, which we represented in purple, or actually it was blue, right? It will be represented in blue, receives these information from your dendrites, right? Your dendrites actively receives all these inhibitory and excitatory neuron signals. And what it does is it's a massive computator, right? Like it adds up everything and it'll check, okay, is the excitatory enough or has my inhibitory raising, okay, let me rephrase that. Has the excitatory level raised my voltage enough or has the inhibitory not let that happen? So let me so say that this one is excitatory and this one is also excitatory, and this one is also excitatory, and this is inhibitory, and this is inhibitory, right? So this is not actually the very most accurate representation, but it's kind of an accurate representation to some extent, right? And your soma does some calculations. Actually your neurons do basic arithmetic. They do addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, and actually they can do integrals as well. So basically it'll use its own function, calculate whether the threshold is reached, and let's take that the threshold is to just add up all the function. This would be 1 1 1 -1 -1, and say, oh, 3 plus -2. Oh yeah, that's like 1. And I think since say my activation threshold was reached, like, okay, I'll my voltage has reached -55 millivolts, your brain will fire, right? So that's the balance that happens between inhibitory and excitatory neurons. Say the roles were reversed, then your brain would say, no, mine is only at 65 millivolts, -65 millivolts. Since action potential is an all or nothing phenomenon, which means that if it reaches -55 or above, then only it will happen. Then, or if it's reaching, or if it hasn't, even if it's -54 millivolts, it won't activate. So it's an all or nothing function. So what happens is your brain makes these conscious decisions, right? So it's basically taking inputs from multiple sources, acts as a microprocessor, and it makes a decision, right? So in this micro decisions, that's the role that excitatory and inhibitory neurons play. So, oh, what happened? Oh well, okay. So in that, I hope that was a pretty good explanation of how inhibitory neurons work. Since inhibitory neurons suppress firing, they basically are like a negative charge almost. The most common inhibitory neuron in the brain is known as GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. So basically, what this one does is it tells your neurons not to fire. Basically, it says, do not fire. But remember that the neurons that release this that's only one input. There are almost like so many more neurons, almost 49 to even 99 more neurons that feed into one neuron to make that decision of whether it fires or not. Remember how we talked about that in neural networks? So we'll connect that back, right? So basically, then is excitatory neurons. So these are the neurons that encourage firing. So basically, they say, yes, you need to fire. This is what we want to do, right? So the most common excitatory neurons in the brain are glutamate. So you've probably heard of glutamate in food. You've probably heard of it in terms of AMPA, NMDA receptors, all that. We'll learn about that when we go over chapter 4 in Brain Facts book, but it's a pretty good thing to know about. So now let's get into the specific histology of these, right? So a neuron can be classified as inhibitory or excitatory, but it can have both inhibitory receptors and excitatory receptors. So let me explain that a little bit more, right? This one took me a little bit of time to understand, and if you don't get it immediately, that's completely understandable. So basically, what a neuron has, right, is your neurons, why am I drawing that? Neurons can only release, I'm sorry for the horrible handwriting, release one type of neurotransmitter. And remember, the relationship between a neurotransmitter and a receptor is like a lock and a key, right? Receptor is like a lock and key. So that means for any one type of neurotransmitter, there can be only one type of receptor, right? So just because a neuron can only release one type of neurotransmitter, and since neurotransmitters are classified as either inhibitory or excitatory, that means that in order for the neuron to receive those signals, it needs to have receptors of both types, right? So a neuron can have, I'm not quite sure what green and red mixes to make, but I assume it would make a really nasty type of like green. So I'll just say both. Oh, that's a very pretty color of green. Oh well. Types of receptors. Okay, whatever. Tried to change the color there, but okay. So basically, a neuron can only release one type of neurotransmitter, but it can receive either excitatory or inhibitory neurons, right? So that's why neurons are classified as either excitatory or inhibitory neurons. But they can receive both types of signals. And that makes sense if you think about it, right? Because just because a neuron suppresses a signal, in order for that to fire, it needs to receive input so that it can suppress other neurons from firing. If it just never sends a signal, then those neurons will become useless and die. So, in order for you to actually decide whether you shouldn't do it, your inhibitory neurons also need to receive those signals. So, just get that and try to write it down, take some notes. It will come to you naturally in a little bit. Okay, so now let's talk about the different types of neurons, right? First, let's talk about the most common type of inhibitory neurons. So basically, these are known as FS basket cells, right? FS basket cells. So inhibitory neurons make up 20% of the neurons in the brain. Neurons in brain, right? And excitatory neurons make up 80% of the neurons in the brain. So, what FS basket cells are the most common type of inhibitory neurons. So, let's change the color to red again. Inhibitory. I'll just abbreviate that. And they make up almost 1/2 of all cortical inhibitory neurons. So, in the brain, remember how in our first video we talked about how cortical means cortex. So, in your forebrain or your cerebrum, the topmost layer is called the cortical layer. So, it makes up almost 1/2 of your cortical inhibitory neurons, right? And these are most commonly found in your thalamus and other forms, right? So, and what they kind of look like to me is they kind of remind me of a very round circular astrocyte shape. So they look like a little circle with little branches coming out like so. And what's really cool about these is that they look very similar to spiders or to astrocytes to me. Those are FS basket cells. The most common type of excitatory neurons are known as pyramidal cells. Okay, so these are the most common type, common excitatory. neurons. And these are most commonly found in the motor cortex, right? Your motor cortex. So basically, what these cells look like is just as their name says, is a pyramid actually. They have one set of dendrites here and two set of axons, like so. With a little cell body right there. And they also have your dendritic branches here, just like that. So basically, okay. So basically, this is one set of dendrites and then another set of shorter oops, what's going on? Oh, okay, my bad. So another set of shorter dendrites here. So this tip right here is what's called the apex of the pyramidal neurons, and these two areas are called the base. So one set of dendrites are at the apex, one set are at the base, while one is actually the axon. And remember, a neuron can't actually have it can only have one axon. It can't have two axons. It can have as many dendrites, as many sets of dendrites, but it can only have one axon that exits the cell, which is this right here. And remember, I don't think I mentioned this in the previous video, but the dendrites and the axons are actually something called processes. So this pyramidal cell actually has three sets of processes, whereas the FS basket cells have so many processes. It's what we can summarize it as. So yeah, now let's talk about what happens if there's something goes wrong with these, right? So basically, or actually, before that, let's talk about connecting these back to the concept of to the concept of the columns, neural columns, right? Neural networks, neural columns, so on and so forth. So basically, what we saw was that neural columns. So neural circuits are basically ordered in the similar way to a bookshelf, right? So they're basically arranged in shelves and so on and so forth. So let's go back to inhibitory neurons, right? So let's re-enter draw mode. Okay, so what I'm going to use is this format that a lot of neuroscientists are used to draw inhibitory and excitatory neurons. So in the Brain Facts book, there are actually two ways that a circuit can inhibit other neurons from firing. One is a feed forward. So let's write that in black. Feed forward. And feedback inhibition. So basically, this format that I'm going to use is basically saying that this is an excitatory neuron and this, let's use a darker color just to match the vibes. This is an inhibitory neuron. So basically, how a feed forward inhibition works in a circuit is what it does is it basically says, say that this is one excitatory neuron here. If an inhibitory neuron is activated, it will go from here and basically inhibit all other columns that connect to that one neuron, right? So it'll send the signals all the way down and will send signals to tell all the neurons to not fire. Remember, just because it sends a signal to not fire doesn't mean that it won't send a signal at all. What it means is that it will send a signal to tell the next one to make the decision not to fire, not to promote that decision. What it will simply say is it's receiving a signal to just stop, right? So, yeah, I just phrased that very confusingly. But this I highly suggest that you read the Brain Facts book because it will make a lot more sense, and the research that I will attach will explain it a lot more clearly. But yeah, essentially what it's saying is it's saying, yeah, just stop. Don't encourage any activity, right? So, and then feedback inhibition, what that does is it basically tells, say that this is one excited tree. What it will do is it'll go like this. There will be a neuron here which latches back, connects to an inhibitory neuron, and continuously tell them to stop firing so that these won't fire anymore. They're just done. So, yeah, that's feed forward and feedback inhibition, right? So, yeah, now let's talk about what happens if there's an imbalance between these two types of neurons, right? So, basically, when you have an excess amount of excitatory neurons, I assume that you can imagine it to be a firing galore. It's like an excess of a firing. Now, that should sound very familiar to you. And it's actually what's hypothesized to be the cause of epilepsy, where there's an abundance of firing. Now, say that there was the opposite of this happening, where there was an abundance of inhibitory neurons. So the abundance of inhibitory neurons basically suppresses anything that you want to do. That's what begins to happen in Parkinson's, right? Or even in paralysis. Actually, what happens in paralysis is that your neurons, the excitatory neurons, and all the neurons in that area just get damaged, so they can't send signals anymore, right? So in that case, technically, if you think about it, there's a lot of inhibition happening there. You're paralyzed, which means you can't send signals anymore, which means that there's technically an imbalance between inhibition and excitation. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, as always, I've linked my email in the description below. I will also be publishing the resources. I've published it actually in my YouTube post, and you guys should be able to see it. I've also published my website, which has some extra resources, practice, and some notes. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Bye bye.